What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today I got a reaction for you guys, another historical reaction. This video is called The Only Land Battle Fought on U.S. Soil in World War II. Because America was we were fortunate in the World War battles because we were so far away from the actual conflicts that we didn't really have too many fights on our own soil. I mean, had the Zimmerman letter not reached, or had the Zimmerman letter not been intercepted, it's possible we could have been in some type of war with Mexico. But that's if Mexico would have actually taken its, actually considered it. But that probably was the closest we ever got to a battle. Now, I've heard stories about, like, the Germans having these experimental weapons that they were trying to do, like, I remember one that had something to do with like balloons or something they were trying to send across the Pacific that would get to the United States. And I don't know if it was like a chemical attack or whatever it was, but I've heard like different stories about certain things. And while that is all speculation at this point, I'm not sure how close them things actually were to being true. Apparently there was, in fact, some battles on the United States. Now, I know there was some casualties on the United States. I believe, I mean, obviously Pearl Harbor, but I mean, as far as like the mainland United States, I believe there was a couple casualties in California that had something to do with, what was it? I think it had something to do with ships firing onto the mainland. I could be wrong, but it was only like a couple of deaths, I think. But whatever. This is an actual land battle. So let's go ahead and read about it. Or not read about it. Watch it and see what it has to say. This video was uploaded by Simple History. I will have a link for Simple History's channel right here. If you guys, it'll be at the end of the video, somewhere around there. So if you want to go to their channel, click on that link. It'll take you to their channel. You can subscribe to them, watch all the other videos. And I always encourage you guys to watch the original video first. Never just watch the reaction, because it's not giving the original content creator a view, which would allow them to continue to make ad revenue on the videos they make. And if they're not making money on the videos, then they're going to stop making videos. So if you support their content and want to see more, watch the original first, then come back and watch the reaction. Trust me, I'm not going anywhere. Also, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like button. Apparently, notifications have been acting funny. And I've heard that the way they promote videos out now has to do with like likes. I'll have to look more into it, but just be on the safe side. If you like this video, hit the like button. But let's go ahead and jump into this.
The Aleutian Islands Campaign. Attu and Kiska, territory of Alaska. The Aleutian Islands Campaign was a military...
Pause. Hold on, time out, hold on. Already I have to put a little asterisk next to this. Are we going to consider Alaska part of mainland United States? I believe the mainland United States was the 48 states that, you know, have to do with the continental United States. Alaska and Hawaii are... I've never really considered them mainland, but I guess technically, because it's still connected to North America, but I don't know. I still put an asterisk next to that one.
Territory of Alaska. The Aleutian Islands Campaign was a military campaign led by U.S. and Canadian forces on the islands of Attu and Kiska. It was the only land battle fought on U.S. soil in World War II. Apart from that, the invasion of the Kiska Island, known as Operation Cottage, is remembered as one of the most bizarre actions in the entire war. During 2 days of sweeping the island, Allied forces had more than 300 casualties, while the Japanese had none. The reason for this was that there were no Japanese soldiers to fight in the first place. In June and July 1942, the Japanese forces, led by Admiral Yamamoto, invaded the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska. The Japanese did this as a diversion from their Midway campaign, but also to prevent the Aleutians being used as a forward base for the Americans to attack Japan. Capturing the island was a relatively easy job for the Japanese forces, as it was defended by negligible forces, 10 U.S. Navy officers from an American weather station. As soon as they took control of the islands, the Japanese started building airfields and fortification systems in the inland mountains. They even brought in 500 civilians to build new military bases, tunnels, and harbors. Since the Americans were fighting Japan primarily for the domination over the Pacific Ocean, there was no doubt for them that the islands had to be liberated as soon as possible. There was also another reason why the United States was so eager to get its territory back. Kiska and Attu were the first pieces of American territory to be conquered since the War of 1812 with the United Kingdom. Their repatriation was therefore a matter of national pride as well. The islands were under the protection of the Alaska Defense Command, or ADC, which only had 24,000 members. The U.S. Army didn't waste its time and immediately started building up its troops in Alaska for the upcoming invasion. By autumn 1942, the size of the ADC had increased to over 94,000.
It's interesting to hear about this story because it's obviously treated like a big deal. They sent thousands of troops to take these islands back, but you don't hear anything about it. Like, you hear about Midway, you hear about Iwo Jima, and the island hopping campaign that the United States had, but you don't really hear too much about the areas in between that. Come to think of it, I don't really remember hearing too much about the islands above Australia, like Indonesia, Guam, places like that. I don't really hear too much about the battles that took place there. I mean, I'm sure they happened, and I'm pretty sure, like, for all I know, they're common knowledge. I don't remember hearing about it, so I might have to go and look up more about it and see what I might have missed, because for all I know, there could have been some key battles too that happened that I just, for some reason, never heard about.
The first target was the island of Attu. Attu was of secondary importance compared with Kiska, which had a fully developed harbor, an operational airfield, and a larger garrison. However, by aiming to conquer Attu first, the U.S. Army wanted to cut the Japanese communication with Kiska. Operation Land Crab. After almost a year of occupation, Navy ships carrying the 17th Infantry Regiment of the 7th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army approached Attu on May 11, 1943. Landing on the island went unopposed, which gave American soldiers a false impression that it was going to be an easy task for them. The Japanese had intentionally withdrawn from the coast to prepared fortifications and bunkers in the inland mountains. They used the natural defenses as well, such as the caves and crevices. Over there, they showed a fierce resistance to American troops, fighting to the very end. After 19 days of battle, only 28 Japanese soldiers out of 2,630 of the 301st Infantry Battalion survived. The Americans also suffered enormous casualties. 3,829 men out of 16,000 engaged.
Wow.
Many of these were due to unsuitable equipment, which led to the soldiers getting frostbite and other medical conditions. On top of this, many of the soldiers had never seen active combat. The Attu experience was horrifying for the American soldiers and largely influenced what happened on Kiska a few months later.
And Russians just chill in this type of weather? Like, for real? You got people over here having frostbite, and I'm sure even though they said they had their equipment wasn't the greatest, I'm pretty sure they had some level of equipment. This Russians treat this weather like it's summer. They have a Siberian okay. I've already told you guys I'm not a cold person. I don't think a lot of Black Americans are cold people, but yeah, this is shocking to me. Frostbite and stuff like that, and you think this is what Russians deal with all the freaking time. Man.
Operation Cottage. Aerial reconnaissance of Kiska recorded a whole system of fortifications similar to those on Attu. Besides, intelligence estimated that they were to expect around 10,000 Japanese soldiers. Everything was indicating that Kiska was to be the next Attu. However, in late July, reconnaissance planes recorded reduced Japanese activity on the island. There was almost no anti-aircraft fire, no movements in the harbor, and destroyed buildings were not repaired. Even radio communications were missing. The radio signals stopped entirely on July 28th. However, the signals of something being very wrong were ignored by Vice Admiral Kincaid. This might have been because the Americans had the events of Attu fresh on their minds. During July, the U.S. Air Force and Navy had conducted severe bombings and shellings of the island, leading some officers to think that this may have forced the Japanese to leave the island. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, who was in charge of the entire operation, had a different impression. He thought that the Japanese had withdrawn to their labyrinth of tunnels and trenches inland, as they did on Attu. For him, there was no doubt that the Americans would have to fight bitterly for the island. For the liberation of Kiska, the U.S. Army engaged more than 34,000 soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division, including the 17th Infantry Regiment, the 53rd Infantry Regiment, the 184th Infantry Regiment, the 4th Infantry Regiment, the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, and the 1st Special Service Force. Except for the 1st Special Service Force, this force consisted of young and inexperienced soldiers. For most, this was their first combat experience. For the invasion of Kiska, U.S. forces were reinforced by 5,300 Canadians of the 13th Royal Canadian Infantry Brigade, codenamed the Green Light Force. This unit included the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the Rocky Mountain Rangers, the Canadian Fusiliers, and other smaller formations. On August 15, 1943, American troops began their landing operation on the middle part of the island, coming from the north. Their entire operation went badly from the start, as ships carrying tanks became stranded because of poor tide calculations. Stranded ships then caused a traffic jam, causing a great delay. Luckily, for the Allied forces, their landing was unopposed, as there was no Japanese resistance. However, this didn't give the American soldiers any peace of mind. They were well aware that they were in the same situation as their comrades were on Attu. Dense fog and extremely cold winds increased the feeling of anxiety and disorientation. On August 16th, American soldiers began moving inland. On the same day, northwest from their positions, the Canadians began their landing operation. As both contingents were moving slowly through dense fog and cold rain, they found no Japanese resistance. All they could find were abandoned positions and an unusual discovery: one dog named Explosion that used to belong to the American soldiers who were captured by Japanese Marines in the initial landings a year ago. At the same time, the American and Canadian troops were suffering casualties.
It's a dog named Explosion.
Talk spread amongst the troops that there were Japanese snipers and soldiers around, which created a sense of panic. Many of them bumped into Japanese minefields and booby traps, which were very difficult to notice because of the fog that reduced visibility to less than a few feet. The destroyer, Abner Reed, struck a mine when entering the harbor on Kiska, killing 70 sailors and wounding 47. But adding greatly to the disaster was when many of the killed and wounded soldiers were victims of sporadic friendly fire. As soon as troops landed, they spread out through the thick fog. On August 16th, a Canadian soldier mistakenly fired on American soldiers, believing they were Japanese. It caused a friendly fire shootout that resulted in 28 Americans and 4 Canadians killed. Around 50 men were wounded on either side. Inexperienced soldiers were terrified by the stories of the Attu carnage and disoriented by the harsh weather conditions and poor visibility caused by the fog. Brian Murphy, a U.S. Army lieutenant who was at Kiska during the ordeal, later recalled that the troops were shooting at anything that moved.
I'm gonna have to ask you to sit down.
One infantryman attacked what he thought was an enemy patrol, and despite patrol members shouting at him to stop, he proceeded to throw grenades. He was then immediately shot by friendly fire. They had anticipated a surprise Japanese attack at any moment. With their nerves on edge, these young soldiers fired upon the slightest suspicion of enemy presence. After 3 days of patrolling the island, American and Canadian soldiers finally realized that there was no enemy to fight, as the Japanese had already left Kiska. After the Second World War had ended, it became known, through interrogations, that the decision to retreat from Kiska was made after the Battle of Attu back in May. Japanese soldiers were also frightened by the Attu scenario, and were additionally aware that any resistance was pointless. In a situation when the Japanese army was desperately in need for soldiers, they were allowed to return to posts closer to home. Back on July 28th, they were carried by several cruisers and destroyers. 5,000 Japanese soldiers had broken through the American naval blockade. They did it with the help of the thick fog. Operation Cottage was met with condemnation in the American press, even though the islands were liberated from the enemy. 92 killed in action and 221 wounded soldiers was a lot to take in for a battle with no enemy present. Lessons were learned from Operation Cottage, and the disastrous landing operations proved to be a good drill for similar campaigns until the end of the war.
This ain't a jump scare, is it? Simple history, you better not be trying to jump scare me right now. Okay.
Hey guys, check out this Simple History merch on Teespring.
Okay. Yeah, that could have been much worse than I thought it was. It looks like they have a Patreon, so I will have a link for their Patreon in the description box of this video. So if you want to show support for the original content creator, and you don't want to watch the original, that's one way you can help support the channel, by going to their Patreon and is it a pledge? Is that what it is? I'm not really familiar with the Patreon lingo, but go and show your support either way. Now, World War II is a very it's a very popular topic, especially among Americans. I've actually heard that there's like a trinity of history in America. It's the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. Those are like the three biggest wars in American history. And so just about anything that covers those topics are things that usually get a lot of attention, especially on like YouTube and things like that. But it's also things that, because World War II in particular was such a important milestone as far as world history, because just think about it. Before World War II, it was like the world was different. Everything that came out of World War II are things that still affect us to this day. We just got finished with the Cold War not too long ago. Looks like the Cold War might actually start again because of remnants from the first Cold War. You have all the conflicts that we're dealing with now, like the wars in the Middle East and North Korea and everything else. Like all that stuff has to do with proxy wars from the Cold War, which were directly related to World War II. Germany, like 30 years ago, just became a country again, or a unified country again. And you look at like the United Nations, the CIA, all these things are things that came from World War II. The America becoming a superpower. Like the world would be completely different had World War II changed even in the slightest. So whenever I see scenarios about World War II, especially like experimental things, like I was talking about earlier with the German weapons that they were experimenting with, and like the Japanese military and the relationship between America and the Soviet Union and the UK and things like that. Like just looking at stuff like that, it really makes you stop and think like, wow, just anything could have freaking happened if you just changed the slightest little detail. And who knows what kind of world we could be living in right now. But yeah, if there's any other interesting stories, in particular from the world wars, be sure to, give a link in the description box, a link in the comment section, so I can check it out, and hopefully I'll do a reaction to it at some point. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. I look forward to seeing you guys in a future video. Be sure to show Simple History some love. Like I said, we'll have a link for their channel right over here somewhere. The last 30 seconds of the video is when the icon usually pops up. And until then, I'm going to give you the deuces, and I look forward to seeing you guys in a future video. Deuces.